How many times have you heard and perhaps spoken the Lord's Prayer? Somebody said that it is the most recited prayer of all time. And then someone else said it is also the most abused prayer of all time. Why? Because we become so accustomed to reciting it that we no longer really think what we are saying. It's kind of automatic, and it is no longer special in so many ways. Well, then why did Jesus give us that prayer? He answered the question and the request of his disciples who said, "Lord, teach us to pray." And then he gave them in Matthew chapter 6 what we call the Lord's Prayer. Did he intend for us to learn it as a recitation and that be the only way to pray those specific words? Well, certainly not, because nowhere in the New Testament after that do we find people actually reciting that prayer exactly that way. So then why did Jesus give us that prayer? Well, many times when we're going to tackle a project, there is a pattern that we follow, kind of principles that make sense. For example, if you're going to install some kitchen cabinets, you know there are some principles that you have to follow. One principle is that you need tools in order to do the installation. You also need to have accurate measurements, another principle. You have to have the right cabinetry to put in. And then there's a certain sequence that you have to follow in order to install it accurately. Well, how exactly you do that, how you do the measurements, what the cabinets look like, and exactly the application of those principles, that pattern, is really up to you. But you follow those principles. And so Jesus, in giving us the Lord's Prayer, has given us, as it were, a pattern, principles that we can follow. I read recently of somebody who came up with 6 words that spell out the principles of what Jesus had in mind for us in the Lord's Prayer, which helps us to pattern our prayers. We fill in the details, but we use those main principles, and they all start with a P. For example, the prayer begins by saying, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name." That represents the principle of praise. You can easily see how that fits in with praise. And we will fill it out in our own words, expanding, praising God. But that's the way to start. But then it goes on and it says, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That represents the principle of priority. We have praise and then priority. Also starts with a P. You can understand how we want to bring ourselves in line with God's priorities. His will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, also in our lives. Well, then he goes on to the next principle, because right after the priorities, we find Jesus saying we should pray and say, "Give us today our daily bread." That represents provision. Don't we need God to provide us with all our needs? And we talk to Him about that. And then right after that is, "Forgive us our debts, even as we forgive those who are indebted to us." That represents the principle of personal relationships. So much of life has to do with personal relationships. And so often those relationships require forgiveness, letting go of bitterness, letting go of things that have made us angry and have upset us. So that is the principle that we want to include in our prayers. Well, then what happens after that? Well, the principle then of protection comes in, where Jesus said in our prayers we should say, "Deliver us from the evil one." And don't let us yield to temptation. That's protection. We need that protection every day, not just from the dangers of physical activity and movement around, but we need protection from the evil one, because he is on the attack and he's always trying to upset our lives. And then what is the final one? Well, we started off with praise, we went into priorities, went into provision, and And then we had personal relationships and protection. How does it end? It goes full circle back to praise. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. So we start with praise and we end with praise. Someone said these are the bookends. Praise are the bookends of our prayers. God big in the beginning, God big in the end, and we carry that with us into our lives. You can follow those patterns, those principles in making your prayer life more meaningful and more directed. That's what Jesus had in mind for us. Somebody said that prayer and the promises of God's Word are the two oars we use to row into the ocean of God's providence, His knowledge, and His guidance in our lives. May you experience a more meaningful prayer life by following the pattern that Jesus has given. I'm Ivan Blake, the senior pastor of the Fletcher Seventh-day Adventist Church. You can find out more about our programs if you go to our website, which is www.fletchersda.org. And there you will find that our purpose is to lift Jesus up and to love people in.